Jimmy Anderson has been struggling in the second innings of test matches, and the presumption is that he's old. And he is old for a pro athlete, let alone a seam bowler. Not to mention that there is a persistent rumour that he's about to retire. Of course, that's not the first time that's happened. A quick Google search found me retirement pieces from 2017, 2019, 2020, and of course this year. Anderson is always near retirement, it seems. The only difference really now is that there are numbers to back it up as well. But it made me think about another period in his career where numbers showed that he might be slipping. It was during the mega Ashes of 2013-14. It was another kind of weird pattern. In the first test of the 2013 Ashes, Anderson was heroic. Sadly, no one really cared about it because Ashton Agar made 98, batting at number 11 with an adorable smile, and Stuart Broad exposed Australian hypocrisy by edging the ball to the keeper, having it rebound to slip and not walking. Anderson also had quite a game though. He bowled 16 consecutive overs at one point. Wow, 3 were before stumps. So he bowled a 13 over spell. He took 10 wickets in the game. It was a really close match as well. And Anderson eventually had to come back on to win the game, and England snuck home by 14 runs. He basically bowled until England won. But that was the mega Ashes, and for those who don't remember what that is, it was 10 back-to-back Ashes tests. Yeah, within the space of 12 months. It was kind of crazy, and it was so that cricket wouldn't clash with other cricket or World Cups or something. I don't know. I think they just wanted to play 10 Ashes tests, if we're being honest. Anderson took 10 wickets in that first test, which is something he's done 3 times. Which is something you see a lot in bowlers who generally bowl in 5-man attacks. It's harder to take their 10-wicket hauls. And to take those 10 wickets, he bowled 55 overs. And there have been 258 times when a seamer has bowled more than 50 overs in a match since the year 2000. Anderson accounts for 20 of them. And that is often in 5-man attacks. Put it this way, Dale Steyn has 4, Broad has 5. Only Bolt and Wagner of the high-usage bowlers seem to bowl 50-over matches more often. And even then, it's very close and they play a lot fewer tests. So Anderson has played the most tests of any frontline seamer ever, and he also bowls a huge amount of 50-over games within that. As George Dobell has probably said, England had a Ferrari and they've been using it to move furniture. Anderson took 26 wickets in the following 9 mega Ashes tests. And if you're thinking, wow, that's 5 tests in Australia. He was just as bad in England, and he also went at over 3 runs and over in each series. Anderson just looked exhausted after that Nottingham test. Now, of course, once he got to Australia, that was just a tough tour in general. Broken fucking arm happened, and it was a 5-zip. Plus George Bailey hit him for 28 runs and an over. England were battered, and so was Anderson. And at that point, I thought Anderson might be done, or at least fading. There was good reason to think that. Swan looked just as finished as Jimmy, and he retired midway through the second half of that Ashes. Matt Pryor's body fell apart at this time. Trust me, I'm saving you by not showing this. And obviously Trotty lost his way. Like many of the best players from that team were dropping off. It was certainly the end of a era, if not the era. And Anderson was about to turn 32. And in the history of cricket, only 38 fast bowlers have taken more than 50 wickets after they turn 32. And as far as average goes, of the highest wicket takers of his era, he wasn't really that outstanding. He was towards the back of the queue. In terms of wickets, he was amazing. You can see the golden end up here. So if you saw this, you could see how England might just start to look elsewhere. I mean, there was never a shortage of seamers in England, and with England's greatest modern team falling apart, they could have phased him out. And they kind of did this before. Matthew Hoggard took 248 wickets in under 8 years for England. After he played his final test, he was the 6th highest wicket taker England had ever had, and he was only 32. Hoggard's test average had always stayed steady around 30. He was a proven wicket taker, and when he would go back to county cricket after his last test, he'd have quite a few good years left in him. And when he was about to turn 32 and Anderson was about to turn 32, their averages were more or less the same. Yet Hoggard was flicked aside like nothing, and Anderson embraced. But there's another player I've been thinking about. Chaminda Vaas is still the greatest seamer Sri Lanka have ever had. He started very young like Anderson and played until his mid-30s. Being that his only partner was an off-spinner for much of his time, he was Sri Lanka's seam bowling. And yet his record is still crazy good. He was such a skillful swing bowler who was never that quick but was always accurate and at you and worked you out. And he was good all the way through his career. And then he had 3 poor tests towards the end and Sri Lanka got rid of him. Vaasa got slow, but he'd never really been quick. And when he was pushed out, he had the 2nd most wickets ever for Sri Lanka behind Murali. No one else had passed 100. and the third person was Sanjay Surya. And Sri Lanka largely let him go because they thought they had a great crop of young fast bowlers coming through. Vas played 3 tests in Asia in '09 and he did struggle in them. But in his last 5 years, there was 86 wickets at 28. In '07 and '08, he averaged under 30. His pace was clearly dropping, but there was no sign of it in his record. And yet he only took 54 wickets after the age of 32. Hoggard was clearly a very good bowler for England, and Vas was a great bowler for Sri Lanka. But they got old. And 32 is considered old, and 35 is considered ancient if you're a seam bowler. Selectors start looking for any sign you've lost a yard once you get to 30, really. These two players got to dangerous ages and people started to see signs of decline and let them go. Anderson had lost more pace than Vas, although he was a lot quicker to begin with, and had a bigger dip than Hoggard. But England persisted with him. And from that last mega Ashes test in January of 2014 until now, he's taken 289 wickets at 21.81. I'm not saying that Vas or Hoggard could have ever have done this. Anderson landed in the most professional cricket team and had levels of support that Hoggard and Vas would never have. They also changed how they used him. He gets rested a lot now and doesn't play white ball cricket. But in tests, well, they haven't quite done the same with his workload from game to game. Anderson is still bowling a lot of 50 over test matches. His overall numbers are down from 36.8 overs to 34.7, but a lot of that has more to do with the shorter tests over the last 4 years. But when England are in trouble, he bowls the same long spells, like the 54.5 overs at Lords this year against India. Part of that was through Cheteshwar Pujara's 200 ball 40, which was then followed up by the Bumrah-Shamsi partnership. But essentially, England got flustered and confused, and they do what they always do. They gave Anderson the ball. So based on what happened at Lords, and also what happened at Nottingham in 2013, I went back to look at test series where he bowled over 50 overs in a test. And it doesn't always correlate, but his average is higher in series where he's bowled big early on. Another thing I noticed was how rare it was for him to take 7 wickets in a match after a bigger spell early in the series. It clearly has some kind of effect on him. But the more research I did on this, the more I realised that outside of the 2013 Ashes and their series against India that just finished, or almost finished, and it seemed like it was having a big effect on him in this series, although he had one good test after Lords and then one very bad test, and we'll never know what would have happened in the 5th test. So I do wonder how much of this is just that you notice things in big series more than you do in smaller series. But it was quite clear that he looked very tired against India at the Oval, and England were already mindful of that. I mean, as they are of bowling him too much, the preparation, treatment and planning of Anderson is like no other bowler before him. If England could surround him in bubble wrap between series, they would. Last year they allowed The Economist to see the kind of planning that Anderson had had. And one of the things that came out of that article was that they had lengthened his run-up to help his calves. Think about that though. Anderson now has a longer run-up than other parts of his career. Well beyond the age where most seam bowlers have already retired, he's running further. And only 3 seamers have ever taken more than 200 wickets over the age of 32. And he's up there with 2 other freaks, Richard Hadlee and Courtney Walsh. And you can see why they took so many wickets as well, as outside of Sid Barnes, who's a bit of an outlier, they just continued to take wickets no matter how old they were. In Anderson's case, he just seemed to keep getting better. While many bowlers got very good after the pace-playing pandemic of 2018, Anderson was doing it 4 years before that. At this point, bowling was tough, and yet Anderson completely changed his record here, and only Steyn, an all-time great, beat him. And the only other player who's close is Rabada, another potential all-time great. But if you factor in the easier bowling era as well, he kept being awesome. And maybe that helped prolong his career as well. Had it continued to be the tough batting era, he might have just hung up his cape. But the wickets are still coming, and so many wickets at an incredibly low average. Like, this is the best bowling averages since the Mega Ashes. And he's got the same record as Pat Cummins with nearly twice the amount of wickets. And what's more amazing is, of course, all the way through all these wickets, he's been over the age of 31. So the pattern of the big early spells doesn't really hold up. And England got their greatest wicket taker ever because they stuck with him and looked after him. But what about the second innings thing? You can see that in his career he's been almost as good in the second innings as the first. However, like most bowlers, he was actually better in the second innings than the first until November of 2018. The lowering of his first innings average makes sense as wickets have been falling way cheaper since then. But why hasn't he been taking wickets in the second innings? And when I say he hasn't been taking wickets in the second innings, I mean it's crazy how much he has struggled. This is just phenomenal. He's taken 13 wickets in his last 21 second innings. That's a wicket every 116 balls. Since that second innings reverse swing spell in Chennai that had him referring to Tom Brady and talking about how he wanted to play forever, he's taken 2 second innings wickets in 110 overs. So that's all pretty obvious. He's not taking wickets in the second innings. But is this an old guy problem? Or is it a bit more like the Mega Ashes thing, which is maybe just more of a weird blip? So I checked all the great old seamers with a lot of wickets over the age of 35, and there's, Anderson and 3 others. And it turns out that the other 3 were still really good in their last 20 tests, even in the second innings. In fact, all of them got better. So I checked all the 35 plus guys, and it turns out that they all got better in the second innings as a group, but most of their wickets actually came from these 4 guys anyway. So I looked up the over 32s, and they also have a better record in the second innings as a group. There is simply no evidence that old seamers struggle in their second innings as they age. So I wondered if this was just something that Anderson had done before. Maybe none of us had noticed it because he wasn't old. Well, from his 3rd test to his 19th, he had a pretty ordinary run in the second innings. He took 18 wickets in 16 matches, at the average of 38. But that's also roughly about how good a bowler he was at that time. So no, there is no pattern in it. He has never been this poor in the second innings before. The other weird thing is that we are kind of ignoring the fact that I just showed you that the average is 18 in the first innings in the last 21 tests. And one thing I keep thinking about was that if Anderson wasn't old when I was watching the Mega Ashes, would I have even been thinking that he might be about to be pushed out? I doubt I would have. And the same with this second innings thing at the moment. If he wasn't old, we really wouldn't even be thinking about that at all. You get to a certain age and everyone starts to check if you're fading. Realistically, there's only been one pattern that Anderson has ever held up. The ability to constantly lower his average for most of the last decade. This here is a pattern, and he's been written off as old and tired before. A whole era of his teammates have been out of the game for a long time now. No fast bowler has ever taken this many wickets, and yet Jimmy Anderson just keeps bowling. Sure, this second innings thing could be a warning sign that his engine is finally dying, or a weird blip we forget about as he goes on to open the bowling for England when he's 45. He might retire. We might have already seen his last test, or we might have quite a few years left of him. A lot of us will look for patterns and signs, but chances are Jimmy Anderson will just pick the ball up and run in and bowl again.